Many things have changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So many of them have to do with data and computing. Of course, you'll have used your phone, the data on your phone, to stay in touch with people, to stay in touch with family, but you'll also have used it to work and be more productive. And to do that, you've probably used the cloud. You've stored your data on a server, usually in a different country, and then gone to go and get it when you need it. And it works so quickly and seamlessly, you don't even know you're doing it half the time. Arthur Goldstuck, the CEO of Worldwide Worx, joins us now. Arthur, good afternoon to you. You've been looking into this. Have more people been using cloud-based computing services in South Africa during the pandemic?
Very much so, Stephen. Thank you for having me on the show. We just released a report this week called Cloud in Africa 2020, and it's the third time we've done the study. And among the most significant findings is that 58% of South African companies increased their investment in cloud computing over the last year. And it has probably turned out to be one of the best investments they've made, because with the pandemic and with lockdown and remote working, it has been the cloud that has saved many organizations. So another key question we asked was what contribution the cloud made to their ability to continue during the pandemic, and something like 9 out of 10 respondents, and this is across 8 African countries, said that it had actually allowed them to continue functioning. And the biggest benefits, in terms of specific benefits, was that it allowed for remote working. I think 8 out of 10 companies overall said that it facilitated remote working, but along with that, the key benefit was business continuity, and that is actually what the cloud permits. And that business continuity, having been proven so brilliantly during this time, means that we're going to see even more turning to the cloud, more investment in the cloud in the coming year, but also more and more we will be accessing services, we as the public, in the cloud without even realizing that we're using cloud computing.
When you talk about services, I mean, what are you talking about? Are people putting spreadsheets, information, documents, that kind of thing?
One of the things we asked in the survey was what applications are specifically being moved into the cloud. Now, there's certain categories that depend on processing their information through the cloud, and we found that finance and human resources are the leading applications for that, along with accounting. But in terms of specific applications in the cloud, the big one was accounting applications. Most respondents said that they had moved their accounting into the cloud. In the small business environment, we still see a migration from traditional computer-based or office-based accounting systems into cloud-based accounting. So, for example, online accounting systems like Xero and Sage are now almost entirely cloud-based, and that's where most larger businesses have moved, but smaller businesses are now discovering that. And when we interact with almost any business in the future, we'll be interacting with them through the cloud.
I mean, what this shows is how safe and secure these services are. I mean, people are trusting their most sensitive information, their accounts, the company's accounts, to these services.
Well, the single biggest concern in terms of security for companies moving into the cloud is data breaches. So they don't feel they're entirely protected, and certain online services and cloud services have either been breached, or human error has resulted in them being breached, or they've actually crashed. We've seen quite a few crashes from the likes of Amazon Web Services, Google, and even Microsoft in the past 6 months or so, as demand on their systems overloads them. Because with people working from home, they're using all the office tools, but also working from home and entertaining from home, you're drawing heavily on the cloud, and that is placing massive pressure on them. Interestingly, there was a major conference this week called VMworld, where VMware's CEO, Pat Gelsinger, spoke about how important it is now to have intrinsic security in the cloud. In other words, it has to be automated, because the more we rely on manual responses to breaches, the more vulnerable we are to the hackers. So those companies that haven't embraced the idea of intrinsic security, even in the cloud, are vulnerable, especially when they go into the cloud.
Okay, so I mean, when it goes into the cloud, you don't always know where your data actually is. For some reason, I always think of a server in Utah somewhere. I don't know why Utah, but I mean, it could be almost anywhere.
Well, more and more we're going to have these servers in South Africa, because in the past year, or year and a half, in fact, we've seen a massive arrival of major data centers in this country. Last year, Microsoft set up its Azure data centers. That's the Microsoft cloud called Azure. Their data centers are in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And then a few months ago, Amazon Web Services arrived with multiple data centers in Cape Town. That was really the big arrival, because when Amazon declares what they call a cloud region, then you know that country has truly arrived in the cloud. And then one of their smaller competitors, Oracle, has also announced that it will make a cloud region in South Africa. And then just this week, Dimension Data announced that they would be setting up their biggest data center yet in Johannesburg. They're a subsidiary of the Japanese giant NTT. So NTT, in effect, is now arriving in Johannesburg with its own data center. So you can see that the cloud is really coming down to earth in South Africa in a big way.
Does all of that make this cloud services cheaper? I mean, are we seeing that the price of cloud services, these kinds of services, is actually dropping?
Very much so. Part of it is that you have more services being available. There's more availability and therefore more competition, and that brings down prices. But also, being closer to the data center means there is far less cost in terms of data transfer, data transmission. Although with fiber, we seem to imagine that there's infinite capacity at infinitely low cost. In fact, that remains one of the high costs of storage in the cloud, but also running applications in the cloud. And the closer you are to the data center, in effect, the closer you are to the cloud, and the less you have to spend on transmission between you and the cloud.
So what does it take to make a cloud-based system fail? The reason I ask that is you want to sort of know how safe it is. I mean, does it have backup after backup?
Backup is the given of cloud computing, and for many organizations, that the first reason they went into the cloud was for storage and backup. But the real issue now is if you're running your applications, in other words, your day-to-day processes are actively being run in the cloud, managed in the cloud. What can happen there, and usually through human error, is that you have what they call a misconfiguration. And we had an example of that very recently, where a major data center in the United States had a misconfiguration, which then was replicated amongst its clients who were internet service providers, and they kind of spread this misconfiguration around the world, and suddenly you had major services crashing. Amongst other, the World Chess Olympiad was almost, it was in fact thrown into chaos, because the Indian participants in the final against Russia weren't able to connect as a result of that specific outage, and they eventually had to declare it a draw between India and Russia. That's as basic as the issue gets, but you can imagine it becomes a massive issue in business continuity as well. These are usually human error, and intrinsic security tends to ensure that human error goes away. Also, automated security and automated management of the cloud, which is something, by the way, that Oracle pushes very hard. Larry Ellison, who tends to be quite a loudmouth when it comes to slagging off the competition, he loves to see this kind of thing happening, because he has been arguing for years that you need an autopilot in the cloud, and many of these cloud services are not autopiloted.
So what happens when that happens? I mean, I can imagine the lawyers rub their hands in glee. Someone somewhere will have some kind of contract, and one little person will get fired.
Well, fortunately for these big providers, they tend to have a lot of small print that excuses them when there's human error involved. But the companies where the human error does take place, you can be sure that the lawyers are watching in great anticipation.